Hello. You know, we have such an unscheduled communication today. It was provoked by statements that we heard from the Kiev regime. The fact is that the minister, the so-called Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Sybiga, began to speak on the topic of Ukrainian prisoners of war on social networks. He linked all this with the meeting that took place from the 30th to the 31st of October in Montreal, Canada, the so-called summit, which was devoted to the problem of the return of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Let me remind you that 45 countries took part in this event. The foreign ministers, of course, of Canada, Ukraine, Sybiga himself was there, Norway, well, and they discussed how to return for some reason to them, to these countries, mainly Western, Ukrainian prisoners of war to Ukraine. And after that, today or these days, Sybiga made entries in the accounts, comments in the accounts on social networks, of the following content. He said that at a meeting in Canada this week, one state allegedly expressed a desire to become, as he put it, a protecting power, in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, in order to help Ukrainians in Russia. Then he, well, at least, so I see the Western agency is also transmitting. He also said that 3 neutral ones, as he expressed from the side, expressed a desire to become, again, his direct quote, the protectors of Ukrainians in Russia, and so on. Hence, accordingly, we began to have questions. We have received a large number of questions today, as a matter of fact, from you, and we decided to answer these complex questions, to tell what is at stake, and what is the matter in general, and why should the fate, so to speak, of Ukrainian prisoners of war be dealt with by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in Canada. And the fact is that this question is by no means rhetorical. It only at first glance seems illogical and somehow unrequited. There is actually an answer, but it is from the category of all those answers that we have already given. The fact is that this is all political performance. All this is necessary because public unrest is already beginning in Ukraine. People ask questions. Where, in fact, are those prisoners of war who were supposed to be exchanged? And the Kiev regime, without answering its citizens to this question, simply glossing over the real state of affairs, creates the appearance of some international efforts that should, from the point of view of banking, be aimed at exerting some kind of pressure on Russia. And now we will turn to the facts, because we have seen the unscrupulousness, rudeness, arrogance, which later turned into extremism, terrorism of the Kiev regime, but still somehow it could be called, although painful logic. What happened today is beyond all good and evil, and this, in principle, is already absurdism. Look at this. First of all, I must say that prisoner of war exchanges are going on, and are regularly going according to a proven scheme. You yourself have witnessed and received reliable information from Russia, from the Kiev regime, and from those who took part in this. There are appropriate mechanisms. These are the human rights commissioners in the Russian Federation. These are the relevant mechanisms that were developed under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense, and so on. In other words, there are well-established channels and authorized persons who deal with these issues. Look, in the 22nd year, with the assistance of international mediators, Moscow and Kiev reached an agreement on the exchange of prisoners of war. During this time, more than 45 exchanges were conducted. As part of these exchanges, About 3,000 servicemen from each side were returned to their homeland. But what is happening now? Currently, the Kyiv regime is literally sabotaging this process, which was both institutionalized and, strictly speaking, gave results. Why? Because they focused exclusively on the exchange of fighters, that is, nationalist battalions. They are interested in those units and those employees, military personnel, representatives of these battalions, which we characterize as extremist, terrorist, nationalist, and so on. What is it about? Azov, Aidar, of course, the right sector, Kraken, the so-called, as they call it, Donbass. And they are also interested in the fate of foreign mercenaries who took part in hostilities against Russia as part of the following units. These are the Foreign Legion, the so-called Polish Volunteer Corps, the Georgian Legion, the Kastis Kalinovsky Regiment, the Legion of Freedom of Russia, as they call it, the Belarusian so-called Volunteer Corps, the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps, the Korean National Battalion, the Siberian Battalion. I repeat once again that it is either from nationalist extremist battalions and units. They are interested in prisoners of war and their fate, or they are foreign mercenaries. Those who represent the armed forces of Ukraine, for some reason, they do not show interest in them, from the Kyiv regime to their own citizens and mobilized military personnel as part of the negotiations between. This was stated and said by the Russian Ministry of Defense, the traditional headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war, created in Ukraine under the auspices of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Russia regularly calls for a return to constructive dialogue and, as a matter of fact, in practical terms, to intensify the exchange of prisoners. Moreover, we always emphasize that this interaction is humanitarian, that this interaction does not aim to achieve any political benefits. We have a connection going on. The connection is restored, right? Great. But we also state that for the Kyiv regime, this process is political, and moreover, they consider it as a media tool to promote their interests. We can talk to you in more detail about their interests if you have any questions, but it is obvious that they are concentrating and doing everything in order to get away from the real concrete work, the results of which were well, obviously you have data on this, in the direction of these endless political and international political performances. That's what it's about. Look, this year the Russian Ministry of Defense handed over 935 Ukrainian prisoners of war to the coordination headquarters for the treatment of military proposals, for the transfer to the Ukrainian side as part of exchanges. Once again, please fix this figure. There was a proposal to transfer 935 Ukrainian prisoners of war. How many of these, out of this number of people, do you think the Kyiv regime has taken for itself? Stressed, its own citizens. Only 279. Can you imagine that? You can probably carry out this simple operation, a calculator, or calculate in your mind that almost 700 people who could return to their families in Ukraine, the Kyiv regime simply disdained them. And at the same time, they continue to travel to Canada and around the world, and allegedly call and negotiate with the international community about mediation efforts, and, as Kuleba said there, patronage of Ukrainian citizens in Russia. You know, I have such a concept of political tourism, when there are some relocations, business trips, but which do not bring any practical results. And in general, in principle, it is unclear why these trips, These visits are needed. What practical sense is there in them? This is the same thing, only much worse, because this is the political tourism of the Kiev regime on the blood of its own citizens, its military personnel, not those who have experienced hatred for years, not thugs who are ready to kill everyone with weapons in their hands, both Russian citizens and residents of the African continent, as it turns out now, but those whom they, well, literally forcibly mobilized, telling that Ukraine needs to be saved, throwing these meat assaults here. They are not interested in their fate, and at the same time, in order to distract the attention of citizens in Ukraine, these very mothers, wives, fathers, children of prisoners of war, they go to the citadel of this Russophobic nationalism in Canada, and then they tell that they have assembled some kind of brigade of countries, perhaps even really these states or these representatives, perhaps, show such zeal and so on out of good. But they apparently are also being misled. They are simply being misled in order to pretend that some efforts are being made. There is a direct way if they want to take their prisoners of war, and all channels for this are institutionalized and working. They just don't want to do it. One more time, why don't they want to? We can talk to you if you have such questions, and perhaps you understand why yourself. At the same time, they are maniacally focused and insist on the return of nationalists, extremists, mercenaries, against whom the Russian law enforcement agencies have sufficient evidence of their committing serious crimes. These are shootings of civilians, robberies, violence, violent acts, including, by the way, of a sexual nature, which the West is always worried about, and in this case, they do not see these crimes at all. Moreover, we have heard in the public plain, and during all these vigils in Montreal, this information also sounded, that Russia allegedly refuses to include Ukrainian Marines in the exchange lists. It's a lie. It's absolutely not true. The fact is that we are ready to publish lists of 29 people. These are the Ukrainian Marines who were returned by the Russian side during the exchanges. Why this information, again, is being hidden by the Kiev regime is a big question. We will provide you with this list, and we will publish it. But that's not all. The fact is that Russia has repeatedly declared for exchanges. A much larger number of Ukrainian Marines were offered for exchange. Here you are, the 36th Separate Marine Brigade. She surrendered in Mariupol in the 22nd year. I am sure that the relatives of these people in Ukraine have no idea that their loved ones, who are prisoners of war in Russia, are ready for exchange, the Russian side said. They just don't tell them about it on bank accounts and lie. The Kiev regime has no interest in exchanging and returning these categories and these citizens, its own military personnel. Next. And now about the reasons. There are probably many of these reasons, but I would like to mention some of them. Once again, you will have questions. Let's focus on this topic in addition. The command of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, we are aware of this, regularly excludes military personnel from the exchange lists of individual units of the armed forces of Ukraine. Why? Because they consider them unworthy of exchange. That's exactly what they say. They believe that those traitors, that they left their positions in violation of orders, that they voluntarily surrendered. I don't know. That's the kind of talk that's going on. That is, they deliberately don't want to take them, you know. We are talking, among other things, about the mobilized formations of territorial defense. These are also categories, and we are considered in the same context. In particular, once again, I want to focus separately on the 36th Separate Marine Brigade. They participated in the fighting in Mariupol, in the Mariupol region, in the 22nd year. Yes, they really voluntarily surrendered and did it on the territory of the Azov steel plant. But this is not the only example, please, and I still proceed from the fact that, yes, we must do this work for Ukrainian journalists and for the Ukrainian mass media, which, apparently, are forbidden to talk about it, but we must do it. Let's name all the parts that do not fall under the right to be returned to Ukraine from the point of view of the Kyiv regime. The military unit 3041 is the Chernobyl M security units, refused to perform tasks, voluntarily laid down their weapons, surrendered in the 22nd year. The Kyiv regime does not want to return them. Ukrainian servicemen of the 102nd Brigade have been in captivity for more than a year, or they were mobilized from the Ivano-Frankivsk region. 111 separate brigades are Luhansk region, 126th Odessa region, 118th Cherkasy region. These are all separate territorial defense brigades. Their relatives should know that this, what's his name, minister of their Sibigo, went to Montreal with their own money. At the same time, he could have solved this issue quite calmly without leaving Kyiv, using the appropriate existing mechanisms. But they are not concerned with the fate of their citizens. They don't care about Ukrainian prisoners of war. They need to get to Montreal, along the way, I'm sure, solve their own issues, maybe beg for money there, or throw their money there, somewhere on the accounts, and then pretend that they supposedly care about Ukrainian military prisoners so much that they are ready to put together this very international coalition. At the same time, they can solve this issue right now, but they do not want to. They do not consider their own conscripts as people, whom they forcibly shove into these meat things, tearing them out of their families. They do not consider as people. Moreover, in these conditions, the Kyiv regime is trying to maintain a real information curtain in order to justify all its actions. That's exactly why they spread tall tales on international platforms, at various international organizations, and at specially convened roundtables and symposiums, and in particular, they do it in the form of formal and official materials that Russia allegedly does not agree to conduct exchanges. I have given you a specific invoice and specific figures today. These are the people that the Kyiv regime refused. These are their citizens. These are their military personnel. Therefore, when you hear that allegedly Russia does not want to conduct exchanges, that allegedly Russia does not give them their people, it's a lie. There are figures and facts. Moreover, this very coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war, this structure, unfortunately, has really turned into a real tool in the hands of Ukrainian so-called politicians. This gang that is holed up on Bankova. And why? Why do they need to turn a working tool into some kind of rattle? But in order not to engage in real exchanges. And they do not need these people. Create the appearance of some kind of activity all the time. Like, for example, the Montreal gathering, and, among other things, in order to substitute this international legal husk, replacing real work, all the time, as it were, to throw up misinformation to the Ukrainian society that the international community will come to the rescue soon, and the issue of prisoners of war will be resolved. I want to emphasize once again that Moscow has never refused this work, has never refused dialogue on the issue of prisoner exchange. Moreover, our existing bodies and designated relevant representatives are working. They have never refused this work. They carry out their tasks set by the country's leadership at the highest level. Our position in this context is unchanged, and it is widely known, including in Ukraine. But the question is that the Ukrainian society should understand how it is once again being deceived by Bankova, Zelensky, and this whole gang-watering can. Moreover, look here, today, well, again today, or here, I saw it a few hours ago. Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, has published information that he receives hundreds, thousands of letters. He even said that more than 2,000 letters from residents of Ukraine in which they asked to cancel his earlier order not to capture fighters in the USU. And he says that he officially declares that the order not to take Ukrainians prisoners has been cancelled, and those who want to surrender to Russian troops will live. But the citizens of Ukraine should understand that when they write and send their appeals, they should understand that their own leaders, who literally abandon them to the mercy of fate, even when the Russian Federation offers them to exchange these people, refuses them.
Даже тогда, когда им Российская Федерация предлагает к обмену этих людей, от них отказывается.
People in Ukraine have been brought to such a state that they are ready to write appeals of the subject of the Russian Federation, in particular to Ramzan Kadyrov, for their last name, with their personal data, with feedback, in order to somehow solve the issue of their loved ones. Do you understand what this is about? They just sent me a question too. The president of the Czech Republic said that he legally allowed 60 people were legalized to be sent to Ukraine. And I want to tell you what it's called. The Czech president doesn't need his own citizens either. And these 60, apparently so to speak, are, from the point of view of, apparently, the Czech Republic, unnecessary people for them. Do you understand? That's how real it is. And then, on international platforms, both the Czech leadership and representatives of the Kyiv regime will pretend to be concerned about the fate of prisoners of war, but in fact things are as I told you about it. If you have any questions, I am ready to answer them.
Maria Vladimirovna, can I ask you a question? Yes.
Yes, of course.
Komsomolskaya Pravda, Vladislav Vorobyov, you said that some of the prisoners of war in Kyiv are considered traitors. And these prisoners of war, they want to go back. Realizing that they are doing this to traitors, they will be shot.
You know, we can't speak for each individual. It's about the fact that here I called the numbers, right? Several hundred people, about 700 people were declared for the exchange. They were declared as such. I didn't want to consider these Kyiv regimes at all, not to talk about them at all, let alone take them. Therefore, we are talking about the fact that the declared people, the people who were prepared for this, made this decision themselves, or the people who made the decision themselves and asked for this decision receive a refusal from the Ukrainian leaders of the so-called, but in fact the Kyiv regime, in the implementation of their constitutional right, legitimate right. Well, we probably won't talk about the morality of justice in the context of banking, but here's what we're talking about. And then, there are already so many stories, there are probably so many variations. This again, I would like to, probably, maybe someone else has questions. After all, there are really existing mechanisms. They are all in the bosom of the Ministry of Defense of our country. The Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Moskalkova, but we respond to statements that were made by diplomatic, foreign policy representatives. After all, we are talking about what happened at the meeting in Montreal, And now we are hearing a statement from the heads of the foreign ministries of these countries. Accordingly, we, through the same diplomatic channels, in the same way from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our country, respond to this whole absolutely informational orgy. There is no other way to call it, because it is not just an event under a non-existent, so to speak, motto and slogans. This whole event is under false flags. This is exactly the opposite of what it really is. In other words, there are Ukrainian servicemen who showed up and were declared by our country to be exchanged, but the Kyiv regime refused them. Ask the question, why? Instead, they arrange these gatherings all over the world and pretend that it is necessary to gather a certain community, to put pressure on Russia, so that it will give up, but not even that's the point. But in order to take care of Ukrainian and prisoners of war who are on the territory of Russia. Forgive me, I won't go into details, but they haven't had a conscience for a long time. But they probably have no shame now either. What they do with prisoners of war, how they treat them, the international community does not want to see in the form of these Western patrons of the Kyiv regime, and we observe all international law, humanitarian law, in the context of people who qualify as prisoners of war. Therefore, there is no need to patronize them. There is simply a need for the Kyiv regime to do what it is obliged to do with respect to its own citizens, those who, strictly speaking, trusted them, and those who were defenseless before these monsters, forcibly pulling people, men out of houses, out of apartments because of the fence. But you have all seen and know all these hundreds and thousands of these video frames that are scattered around the world. But for some reason the Western minority does not pay attention to this, but at the same time, they organize gatherings like this in order to sympathize with the Kyiv regime and invent tall tales on how to take care of Ukrainian servicemen who are in Russian captivity.
Thank you.
Maria Vladimirovna, hello, Valentina Schwartzman, ARBC. Let me clarify, please, whether I understand correctly, that there were no appeals, yes, from certain countries that the foreign minister of Ukraine spoke about, to become patrons, yes, Ukrainian citizens. They were not received. I don't know anything about this, but I would like to draw your attention to the statement made even today by the head of the International Committee of the Federation Council, Mr. Karasin, who said that we are open to contacts, and at the same time, I would like to add that if someone has such a desire to provide some kind of mediation, then it would be nice for these intermediaries to turn to the Kyiv regime on the basis of the facts we have voiced today. In what? In what? One more time, I want to repeat it again. We have never refused any kind services. We are always grateful to those who show mercy on the battlefield. These are lofty ideals, and it's great when people are driven to the battlefield not with the words of a barrel, but when people talk about the need and the existence of a humanitarian dimension. They talk about peace, about a political and diplomatic way to resolve conflicts. We have always appreciated such expressions of will and similar efforts or similar intentions. But at the same time, I want to draw attention to the fact that mediation is needed here in order to reason with the Kyiv regime, to take away their own citizens whom they refuse. I even named specific brigades, their specific names, their specific numbers. This is not just a statement criticizing or disavowing these comments of Sibiga statements. These are concrete facts that Ukrainian society needs to work with, and if mediation is really needed, then, in my opinion, it would be necessary between the Kyiv regime and the Ukrainian people. That's where, in my opinion, there is no mutual understanding. Do you understand? Because people in Ukraine are being fooled. They've been fooling around for years, but in such a way that they first took away and mobilized men in Ukraine, lowered the draft age, threw people to the obvious death, and then did not take away those who either surrendered or were captured. And people would not be told the truth, and at the same time pretend that they care so much that they need to go straight to Montreal. And this is probably where some kind of international mediation is needed, so that the Kyiv regime still fulfills its constitutional obligations to the Ukrainian people. By the way, we have repeatedly seen intermediaries in the internal political life of Ukraine who came from abroad. All the maidens were mediated, and the foreign ministers of foreign, primarily Western countries, and others did not come. Only Westerners were, only NATO members, assumed the function of dialogue between the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government, leadership, and the ruling class. Here's a great story. Let them establish contact between the citizens of Ukraine who are being mobilized and the Kyiv regime, and try to explain to the citizens of Ukraine the position of the government or their, I don't know what to call Zelensky, the president or the overdue president. Therefore, to us, I do not know about such statements or about such intentions of someone from foreign countries. Only now we have read, so to speak, this information from Civica on social networks, but I say again, specific figures have been announced from our side. Let the Kyiv regime explain itself to the international community. Since the Kyiv regime has set this as a task for the international community, well, and for its own citizens. Maria Vladimirovna, hello, news information portal, Ru Rustam, we have such a question. As reported at a meeting of the UN Security Council, Ambassador Vasily is not a pension. 5 and 3 million refugees from Ukraine moved to Russia only in the first year of the SPO. Moreover, as the migrants themselves told our publication, many of them moved to Russia after first living in the EU countries. In your opinion, why do the citizens of Ukraine prefer Russia despite their own? Because we are talking about the fact that Ukraine, due to interference in the internal affairs of this country, NATO members were literally cut up, first of all pitting part of the Ukrainian society. This process lasts for many years, artificially conducted, provoked maidens, and then they simply turned into real political actions, which they led. Do you remember who? A Secretary of State, foreign ministers of Germany, Poland, France, ambassadors of NATO countries, and people were pitted against each other. They pitted people who were focused on friendly relations, family relations, historical relations with their neighbors, both with Russia and with other neighboring countries, by the way, and at the same time did not refuse integration into the pan-European space and interaction with other parts of the world. They were pitted against those who were focused on the fact that Ukraine should be exclusively in the bosom of the Western community. Whether the pitting is intentional, artificial, including through the dissemination of fake information, and therefore we have achieved that people no longer feel at home in Ukraine. They understood that they would find a home, not just a temporary shelter, but a real home in Russia, which protected their rights. Here you are talking from the moment of your birth, and quoting our permanent representative Pryan, sir, I do not mind. We recall that it was only from the beginning of your life that so many people sought protection, patronage from us, or simply moved to the country, realizing that this is the real homeland, and not the one that has been for so many years she was tormented, and only pretended to be her homeland, but before that, and since the 14th year, when millions of people sought protection from Russia, came, stayed, received citizenship, or tried to connect or adjust life, returning to the territory of Ukraine, just waiting and thinking that now everything will get better. And then anyway realizing that it's not that they are not happy there, but they are simply being swept out there, crossed out. How much humanitarian aid was sent? Remember how we were bullied when the first vans with humanitarian aid went to the territory of Ukraine, as the same Western agencies and the media said that this is the beginning of the invasion. You remember telling nonsense about the transfer of weapons and so on, but they transferred textbooks, medicines, generators, in order for people to be heated. That's why. Because Russia protected, fed, watered, provided jobs, places in kindergartens, schools, jobs, provided the entire social package, provided rights, opportunities. Therefore, and as for Western countries, you see, everything is like in Krylev's fable. The summer is over and that's it. And they begin to deport Ukrainian citizens, stop social support programs, or priority employment. There is nothing more to please the citizens of Ukraine on the territory of Western Europe, and some Western European countries did not want to take them at all. Do you understand? This was all necessary in order to inflict, as they put it, a strategic defeat on Russia. And Ukraine was used as a tool, and it was necessary to use the citizens of Ukraine to show them at rallies, to use them as demonstrators in front of Russian embassies, to incite them against some communities of our compatriots, to destabilize the work of those businesses, companies, structures that were focused, continued to be focused on Russian markets. That's why they needed Ukrainian citizens, including, as well as the gratuitous labor force, the one that came to the court, the one that more or less met the qualification requirements. Those were left, everyone else. Now, they are starting to squeeze, so to speak, from the territory of Western Europe. Well, we won't talk about children at all. This is a separate topic. What happened to the children there, where the children disappeared? That's why. And then, it seems to me that we do not abandon our motto. It has been repeatedly confirmed in our practical steps and actions over the past years, no matter what it costs us. Thank you. So, are there any more questions?
Andrei Vladimirovna.
Yes.
At the same time, together.
Yes. Here's a star, please. A star.
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon. Igor Lapik, Zvezda TV channel. There was information that the Polish foreign minister offered Ukraine to buy weapons on credit to the Republic, but at the same time, they would have supplied them for free earlier. What do you think explains such a cooling of relations between Poland and Ukraine now?
And do you think that everything else that was provided to Ukraine was provided free of charge? Or what? Ukraine is all over. It can't even be called credited or over-credited. Ukraine has been in bondage for decades. It pays with its subsoil, with its land, which is given over to GMOs for all kinds of experiments, or simply the soil is exported. It pays with its citizens. Remember the Ost Plan, the one that was developed in the Third Reich. What should have been done with the Slavs, either put them into service or destroy those who are unfit for service, isn't that what the West is doing to Ukrainians? Those who, as we have just said, are fit to provide services, for example, to Western Europe, or the same Canada or the USA, where they have reached, will leave those, and those that are unsuitable from the point of view, again, of NATO members, will be used up. The same ideas as 80 years ago, and not only that, future generations will have to pay for the crimes of the West with their money, their resources first of all. There won't be any money there. The question is that they will pay with resources. It was the richest country, free, washed by sea waters, with amazing arable territories, with opportunities for everything agriculture, animal husbandry, but it was considered a breadbasket all its life. A storehouse from the point of view of natural resources. Everything is there. It was. And now all of this is being put under control, either directly sold to Western multinational companies, or through lending forever, as they believe in the West, in bondage with them. so that people in Ukraine do not even have the right to claim their own resources.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Maria Vladimirovna. Dmitry Balashev, Arguments and Facts. In addition to forgiving Sibiga, he said that Moscow allegedly denies international observers and doctors access to prisoners, and, unexpectedly, civilian hostages. Please comment on his words.
Well, it's the same lie. He had to go to Montreal, you know. He needed to declare himself in some way. What did you have to come with? So they gathered tall tales. They formed about them in the training manual and began to tell. I'm telling you about the real numbers and the names of those brigades from where the Ukrainian servicemen were captured, who surrendered, who was surrounded. They fell in different ways, over whom they cannot, either by themselves or with the help of international observers, carry out observations or monitoring over these. They don't even want to take them. They don't want to hear about them. They are interested in either thugs, well, just so to speak, inhumans, who can be immediately involved in other areas, or foreign mercenaries, for whom Westerners pay them through all these loans and so on. And to the West, one way or another, they somehow have to answer for the mercenaries and those citizens of Ukraine who are separated from their wives and mothers and children. To whom will Zelensky, or what, report to them? He has deceived them many times. He does not consider them as people at all. Therefore, this is all an absolute lie. We have a commissioner for human rights. She is in contact with her Ukrainian counterpart. And when this Ukrainian counterpart is allowed, then he begins to carry out his humanitarian functions. And then the situation changes. They are not interested in people. For them, people are expendable. Well, it's clear already.
Thank you. Maria Vladimirovna.
Yes, yes. Look how symptomatic it is. We also called the Western media. For some reason, there are no questions yet. Yes.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
So, there is someone behind this decision, as in the case of detainees in Gaza. You think? Do you think the US can follow this?
And about what not to take away.
Yes, don't take it. And I'm interested. Even the Gaza Strip is not interesting to anyone. Hostages are fighting and killing people.
You know, well, here we can talk about what kind of independence the Kiev regime can have. They manifest, it seems to me, so to speak, this one. Well, maybe not independence, but they get out of control when they need money or something else. That's when they resort, for example, well, I do not know, to the topic of nuclear weapons. As Zelensky now demanded to give him a nuclear bomb, otherwise they will assemble it there themselves. Here he was given 50 billion in return. That's when we can say that they somehow get out from under the full supervision of the West. And on other issues they are completely in the bosom of Western decisions. They don't belong to themselves. If, excuse me, there were no precedents in the world, in my opinion, that the government itself forbade communicating with the other side on the topic of peace negotiations, or holding any negotiations at all. There were no precedents. Why? Because how can the state people tie their own hands when it comes to the fate of their people, their country, their people? But even then it became clear that at first the British pressed for there to be no negotiations, and then the Americans forced such a decree or such a law to be adopted, signed, and so on. Therefore, they are completely in this American, Anglo-Saxon influence.
Thank you.
Thank you. You can tell now, here are the latest figures. How many prisoners of war Russia has and yours. These wraiths, these figures are within the competence of our Defense Department. I have presented to you the figures that were announced for exchange, and I have told you a specific figure, this particular figure, and Russia was ready to present it to the Ukrainian country for exchange. I hope you have the courage to write about it. I'll repeat it again. I'll repeat it again. Suddenly you couldn't write it down after all. It's important. 935 Ukrainian prisoners of war were presented, declared for exchange. Only 279 were taken. If you really, as Western journalists, as Western public figures, are interested in the fate of Ukrainian citizens, but ask the Kiev regime, the Kiev Minister of Foreign Affairs and Other Affairs, the Kiev diplomat a question, why didn't they take away almost 700 of their servicemen? Well, here I see you smiling, probably. I hope it's not a grin. I hope that you are genuinely concerned about this topic. So, do you have any more questions? Of course. I'm sorry. So, if there are more questions. Maria Vladimirovna, yes. Valerie Hopkins, The New York Times. Here, I wanted to clarify. Yes, and one process is to change both civilian people and prisoners of war, or in general, or only there is a negotiation process for prisoners of war. Oh, wait, I haven't heard of anyone being held from civilians. If you are talking about civilians, against whom there are criminal cases, then after all, this is not a question of detaining civilians. It is a question of crimes and punishments. If we are talking about prisoners of war, I have told you that there are mechanisms between the Ministry of Defense and the relevant department in Ukraine, under the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine created, which deal with these matters. The issues of civilians, among others, are under the jurisdiction of the Commissioner for Human Rights. Well, there are different situations, but there are also commissioners for children's rights who also have contacts with the other side, with the Ukrainian side, and are in contact with international officials, with the Ionians on the topic of children, finding children, returning children, parents, solving social issues with children. And we have already had 2 briefings by our country's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Zakharova. I think it is quite. I will not announce it, because this is a matter of her competence, but I think that there are already quite a lot of questions for another briefing. I think it would be quite possible to think about such a holding. In other words, each direction has its own authorized representatives, or its own mechanisms that solve certain issues. Yes, it's just that in Ukraine, there are not many Russian civilians there, only prisoners of war, and you have more civilians. And secondly, and I don't understand what it means. What kind of civilians do we have? Are there many Ukrainian civilians in Russia? Who do you mean? Who are in the new territories, or in the occupied territory, who are civil, who are not military persons. And in Ukraine, here it is, wait a minute, we have regions of the Russian Federation, you can call them new, whatever you want to call them. We call them our regions. Who do you mean there? If we are talking about those who are on charges under criminal proceedings, or have already been sentenced, are you talking about these people, as well as civilians? Yes, but among other things, the human rights commissioners deal with them, of course, their fates, yes, but it is necessary. Just please don't say that they are being held. They are in the framework of criminal or administrative processes and so on. These are not just those who are. Yes, it is precisely with regard to the residents of the Kursk region that we can say that they are being held by representatives of the Kiev regime in those territories that they occupy forcibly, without trial and without investigation. And we do not have such a thing on our territory with respect to citizens of Ukraine. Excuse me. And when there is a question of a court hearing, just the other day, on Wednesday and on Thursday, 3, in my opinion, court proceedings in Rostov were closed. And now, well, there is news that, or there is, many say that they will close now because of the statement of the Ukrainian character Dmitry Gordon. And what do you think it is? Well, probably, if these processes would have remained open, it would probably have been easier to somehow arrange some more understanding or new conditions for exchange. Tell me please, are there closed processes in America? Well, sometimes, but this, we sometimes have. With us, they were open now. I just want to say that each country has its own procedures, and you have closed processes, and we have them. There are such processes in any country. We are now talking about the fact that the Kiev regime does not want to be interested in the fate. It does not take away those of its citizens who were declared. Here you are talking about closing processes that it could help. There are about 700 people declared here. Take it away, they don't take it away. What are you talking about? Why are you diverting from the topic of conversation? The topic is obvious. Almost 700 Ukrainian servicemen and servicemen could have been returned to Ukraine, and the Kiev regime does not take them away. What does it have to do with closed or open processes? What could be more open or closed? What do you want? Their names. The only chance to be seen. Lawyers also say that Ukrainians are holding some of their clients now, and they do not have access to their clients. I'm telling you, about 700 people were ready for the return of Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities do not take them away. Well, I'm not responsible for them. I don't know. But here I am. That is why we are communicating with you today, so that you will know about it, so that you perhaps ask this question to the very lawyers you refer to, or to the Ukrainian representatives with whom you communicate. Why don't they take them away? Because, of course, it is much more interesting to ask questions, or give press conferences, or give interviews, and talk about how Russia closes trials, and the fate of Ukrainian citizens, for example, becomes unknown. Here is the well-known fate of 700 people, whom we have presented in order to transfer to the Ukrainian side. They are not interested in their fate. They are called different names. Representatives of the Kiev regime do not want to return them to their homeland. Therefore, I perfectly understand why you are asking this question. You have the right to it, and I have the right to say that with such questions, you divert the situation, and you take your eyes away from the pressing problem that can be solved. And it can be solved not through Montreal, but here, between authorized structures and authorized persons of the two countries. Do you need international mediation? The Kiev regime, please. We have never given up on this, but there are specific destinies of a large number of people. It's just that the Kiev regime does not need to abandon them. These are their citizens. Moreover, these citizens who were dissatisfied, these citizens were mainly mobilized. Do you understand? That's what it's about. I understand it's very unpleasant to find out about it, but I have to. So let's go further. Any more questions? No. If there are any questions, thank you very much. The lists of those who have already been transferred from the Marines of Ukraine to 20 people, 29 people, we will publish in the near future in the resources, online resources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in social networks. Thank you, goodbye.